The tavern known as Imberhall did not exist on any map drawn by mortal hands. It was not hidden by distance, nor concealed by illusion alone. Rather, it existed in a place that most beings could not endure long enough to recognize, a volcanic ridge where the earth itself breathed fire, where the ground pulsed faintly with ancient heat, and where the sky was perpetually veiled in a haze of ash and dim crimson light. To approach Imberhall as a human was to invite death. To survive the journey was to prove something far more dangerous. The structure itself had been carved, not built. Its walls were hewn directly from obsidian veins that had cooled centuries ago, polished by time and heat until they reflected distorted images of anything that moved nearby. The doorway stood wide and unguarded, but the threshold was not unprotected. Nothing mundane crossed it unchallenged. Inside, the air shimmered, not from simple warmth but from layered enchantments older than human history. The temperature would have boiled a river, yet it felt strangely tolerable, as though the heat had been taught restraint. It was a place designed for beings who did not fear fire. A place built for dragons. They did not arrive in their true forms. That would have been impolite. Instead, they entered as echoes of humanity, tall figures cloaked in velvet or steel, scholars with long fingers stained by ink, warriors whose armor carried the weight of forgotten wars, nobles with rings that glowed faintly like banked embers. But illusion could only do so much. There were always signs. Eyes that glowed too brightly in shadow. Voices that carried a resonance too deep for human lungs. Movements that hinted at something vast and coiled beneath the fragile disguise. And sometimes, when their attention slipped, the air itself bent around them, as though reality remembered what they truly were. Imberhall was neutral ground. It had been so for longer than most kingdoms had existed. Here, ancient rivalries paused, wars were discussed instead of waged, deals were struck that shaped continents, histories were corrected or rewritten entirely. And sometimes, the dragons came simply to observe, to remind themselves that they were not alone in eternity. On this particular night, Imberhall was unusually full. The long central chamber flickered with low-burning braziers, their flames casting gold and crimson light across polished stone. Shadows stretched long and thin, twisting across the walls like living things. Conversations murmured in low tones, layered and complex. Some spoke of trade routes, others debated territorial claims. A few exchanged quiet threats wrapped in polite language. And beneath it all, there was tension. Not hostility. Something subtler. Expectation. Because tonight something unusual was present. A human's. She moved through the room with quiet efficiency, weaving between tables without hesitation, her steps measured and precise. In her hands she carried a tray laden with drinks, crystal glasses filled with liquids that shimmered faintly, some glowing, others shifting color like captured sunsets. The tray should have been impossibly heavy. It did not slow her. Her name was Lysa. She wore no armor, no enchanted garments, no visible sigils of protection. Her clothes were simple, a dark apron tied neatly at her waist, sleeves rolled just enough to free her hands. Her hair was tied back, practical and unadorned. She looked ordinary, and that more than anything made the dragons watch her. Because nothing ordinary survived here. A pair of younger dragons, new to Imberhall, their illusions still slightly unstable, watched her pass. She's human, one whispered, though the statement felt inadequate. Yes, the other replied slowly, but she is not behaving like one. That was the problem. Humans who encountered dragons typically reacted in one of three ways: fear, reverence, or denials. This one showed none. She did not avoid eye contact, nor did she seek it. She did not hurry, nor did she linger. She simply moved as though the room belonged to her just as much as it did to any ancient being seated within it. And perhaps most unsettling of all, she did not smell afraid. At the far end of the hall, a group of elder dragons occupied a wide circular table carved from a single slab of black stone. They were among the oldest present, perhaps among the oldest still alive. Their forms were more refined, their illusions more complete, but even so, power clung to them like heat from a forge. The space around their table felt heavier, denser, as though the air itself bowed under their presence. 5 of them, each distinct. One wore armor etched with symbols that no longer had meaning in the modern world. Another appeared as a thin scholar, his fingers steepled as he listened more than he spoke. A third leaned back lazily, his smile sharp, eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. The fourth remained silent entirely, observing. And at the center, the eldest. His illusion was the simplest, an older man composed unassuming. But his eyes burned. Their conversation had turned, as it often did, toward humanity. Short-lived, one of them said, swirling the contents of his glass. They rise quickly, fall faster. Fragile, another added. Their bodies fail them long before their minds begin to understand the world. Adaptable, though, the scholar murmured, that trait bears watching. The armored one snorted softly. Adaptation is meaningless without time. A pause, then with faint disinterest. Useful perhaps, said the smiling dragon, but ultimately insignificant. The others did not argue. They did not need to. For most of history, that assessment had proven correct. It was then that Lysa approached. She stepped into the edge of their presence without hesitation, the tray balanced easily in her hands. The heat at their table was higher than anywhere else in the room, not by accident but by nature. Most humans would have recoiled. She did not even flinch. Your order, she said calmly. One by one she set down their drinks. No spill, no tremors, no hesitation. The eldest dragon watched her closely. Too closely. When she turned to Lev, he spoke. You understand what we are, little human. The question was not gentle. It carried weight, an invisible pressure that settled over the space between them. Lysa paused. Then she turned back. Yes, she said. No elaborations. No uncertainty. Just a yes. A flicker of interest passed through the group. And yet, another dragon said, leaning forward slightly, you serve us without trembling. It was not accusation. It was curiosity. Lysa met his gaze. There was no challenge in her expression. But there was no submission either. Should I, she asked. The simplicity of the response caught them off guard. For a moment, there was silence. Then the smiling dragon laughed softly, the sound like stone grinding against stone. Perhaps not, he said. Tell me then what makes your kind so bold. Around them, conversations began to quiet. Not abruptly, gradually, like a tide pulling back. Dragons were listening, even those who pretended not to be. Because something had shifted. Lysa stood very still. Not frozen, not afraid, thinking. The tray rested lightly against her palm, as though it weighed nothing at all. For a brief moment her gaze drifted, not to the dragons but beyond them, as though recalling something distant. Something personal. Then she looked back and spoke. My mother bears your mark. The words were simple, unadorned, delivered without emphasis. And yet, they struck like a thunderclap. Silence fell. Not quiet. Silence. Total, absolute, immediate. Every voice in Ember Hall ceased. Every movement stopped. Even the flames in the braziers seemed to falter, as though the world itself had paused to listen. Because there were only two meanings to that sentence. And neither of them was possible. At the central table no one moved. No one breathed. The smiling dragon's expression froze, amusement draining away in an instant. The scholar's fingers tightened, knuckles paling. The armored dragon's hand shifted, just slightly toward the hilt at his side, an instinct older than reason. And the eldest stared. Not at her face. At her. As though trying to see through skin and bone to something deeper. Something hidden. Across the room a chair scraped faintly against stone. Too loud. Someone had moved. The sound echoed. Then died. Still no one spoke. Because to break that silence was to acknowledge the words. To give them weight. And no one was ready to do that. At the edges of the room, illusions flickered. Just for a moment. A flash of scale. A glint of claw. A hint of something vast and terrible pressing against fragile human shape. Emotion. Dragons did not lose control easily. But when they did, Reality noticed. My mother bears your mark. The sentence repeated itself, unspoken but present, rippling through ancient minds. Impossible. No human survived the marking. That was law. Not tradition. Not belief. Law. Older than kingdoms. Older than written language. Older than Imberhal itself. The mark was not decoration. It was not a symbol. It was a bond. A claim. A piece of a dragon's power pressed into another being. And for a human's, it was death. Always. Without exception. There was no ritual to prevent it. No spell to soften it. No exception. Until now. The eldest dragon rose. Slowly. Deliberately. The movement carried weight not physical but something deeper. Something that pressed outward, filling the room. Illusion wavered. For a fraction of a second. Something vast coiled beneath the surface. Scales like molten gold. Eyes like burning suns. A presence so immense that the air itself seemed to thin around it. Then, the illusion snapped back into place. But the memory of it lingered. You will explain, he said. The words were quiet. But they were absolute. Not a question. Not a request. A command. And for the first time, all eyes turned fully to Lysa. She stood exactly where she had been. Tray in hand. Posture unchanged. Expression calm. She did not step back. She did not bow. She did not rush to speak. Instead, she held the gaze of something ancient and did not break. The silence stretched. Heavy. Waiting. Then, at last, she answered. She never told me his name. Her voice was steady. Too steady. Only that he was not humans. A murmur rippled through the rooms. Soft. Controlled. But unmistakable. Dragons shifted. Leaning forward. Listening. Because the impossible was no longer hypothetical. It was speaking. And it sounded human. The eldest dragon's gaze sharpened. Describe the mark, he said. The temperature in the room seemed to rise. Not from fire. From attention. Every mind in Imberhal focused on her. Every sense extended. Every instinct alert. Lysa hesitated. Just for a moment. And in that moment, the dragons saw it. Not fear. Something else. Consideration. Then she made a decision. She set the tray down on the table. Carefully, deliberately, as though nothing about this moment was unusual. Then she reached up and pulled back her sleeve. But not her arms. Her shoulder. The fabric shifted, revealing skin. And there, faint but unmistakable, was the mark. It shimmered, not brightly, not aggressively, but with a subtle distortion, like heat rising from sun-scorched stone. A pattern of lines and curves that seemed almost to move when viewed too closely. No human mage could have created it. No artifact could replicate it. It was alive. The reaction was immediate. A sharp intake of breath from multiple directions. A chair cracked under sudden pressure. Someone stood too quickly. No, a voice whispered. Another harsher. Impossible. The armored dragon took a step forward, eyes locked on the mark. That is. He stopped. Because there was no need to finish the sentence. They all knew. A dragon's mark. Real. Undeniable. And carried. By a human's. The scholar's voice trembled just slightly. No human survives the marking. It was not a question. It was a statement. A law. Lysa lowered her sleeve. Apparently, she said, that's not entirely true. Silence fell again. But this time, it was different. Not shock. Not disbelief. Something else. Something far more dangerous. Reevaluation. Because if one law was broken, What else might be wrong? And for beings who had built their existence on certainty, that was a far greater threat than any enemy. The eldest dragon exhaled slowly. The sound was soft, but it carried. Your mother lives, he asked. Oh, yes. And she carries this mark still. Oh, yes. No hesitation. No doubt. Only certainty. The dragon's gaze did not leave her. And you, he said, have seen it. Oh, yes. A pause. Long. Measured. Then. Either one of our kind has broken laws older than this world. Or, the world itself has changed. And we did not notice. The thought hung unspoken. But it was there. In every mind. In every glance. In the tension that filled the room. Lysa tilted her head slightly. A small movement. Almost curious. Maybe, she said, you just never looked closely. When that, more than anything, landed, because dragons prided themselves on knowledge, on understanding, on seeing what others missed. And yet, here stood a human, unbroken, unafraid, carrying proof that something fundamental had been overlooked. The eldest dragon leaned closer. Not physically, but in presence, in focus. Child, he said quietly, do you understand what you are? The question lingered. Heavy, important. Lysa met his gaze. And for the first time, there was something new in her expression. Not fear, not arrogance, awareness. Yes, she said. And somewhere deep within Emberhall, something shifted. For the first time in centuries, a dragon hesitated. The eldest dragon at the table rose slowly. It was not a dramatic motion. There was no sudden flare of power, no explosion of flame, no outward display meant to impress or intimidate. He simply stood, and the world reacted. The air grew heavier, thickening as though it had suddenly remembered gravity. Heat deepened not in temperature alone, but in presence, in density, in something older than fire itself. The polished obsidian floor beneath him gave a faint, protesting sound, as if it carried a weight it had not been designed to bear. Every dragon in Emberhall felt it. Not through sight, not through sound, through instinct, through something buried deep in their being, something that recognized hierarchy long before language existed. The eldest had risen, and that meant something fundamental had changed. Illusion flickered. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible distortions along the edges of his form, like heat rippling above a desert horizon. His outline wavered, bending light in ways that no human shape should. Then, for a fraction of a second, the truth pressed through. Something vast, something coiled. Scales that gleamed like molten gold, each one reflecting not just light but time itself. Wings folded into dimensions that did not quite align with reality. Eyes that burned, not with flame, but with a brilliance that spoke of suns long extinguished. It was not a full revelation. Not even close. But it was enough. Enough for every dragon present to feel the weight of it. Enough for every instinct to whisper the same truth. Ancient, powerful, dangerous. The illusion settled again, snapping back into the shape of a composed, older man. But the room did not forget what it had glimpsed. You will explain, he said. The words were quiet, measured, controlled. But beneath them lay something vast and immovable, an authority that had not been questioned in centuries. It was not a request. It was not even a demand. It was inevitability. Across the hall, conversations that had only just begun to recover died instantly. Even those who had tried to ignore the unfolding moment now found themselves unable to look away. The attention of Emberhall, of every ancient mind within it, focused entirely on a single point. A human's. Lysa did not step back. She did not flinch. She did not even shift her stance. She simply stood there as she had before, the same quiet steadiness in her posture, the same unhurried calm in her breathing. If she felt the pressure, she did not show it. And that, more than anything, unsettled the dragons. Because they understood pressure. They wielded it. They knew exactly what it did to lesser beings. And this was not how a human should react. She never told me his name, Lysa said. Her voice carried clearly through the silence. No tremors, no strain, only that he was not humans. The words spread through the room like ripples through still water. Dragons shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to an untrained eye. But their attention sharpened, their illusions thinning just enough to betray the intensity of their focus. Curiosity, concern, recognition. Somewhere at the back of the hall, one of the younger dragons leaned forward, eyes narrowing. That is not possible, he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. Another older shook his head slowly. Not impossible, he said, merely unprecedented. At the central table, the eldest dragon did not look away from Lysa. Not even for a moment. Describe the mark, he said. His voice had changed. Softer now, lower, but far more dangerous. Because beneath it lay something deeper than authority. Something personal. The request, no, the command, hung in the air. Lysa hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. The hesitation did not speak of fear. It spoke of decision. Of choosing what to reveal and what to withhold. The dragons noticed. Of course they did. They noticed everything. And that brief pause told them more than any immediate answer could have. She understood the weight of what she carried. She understood the consequences of showing it. And still, she chose to proceed. Slowly, deliberately, Lysa set the tray down on the table beside her. The sound was soft, almost insignificant. And yet in the silence of Imberhall it seemed to echo. A marker, a point of no returns. Her fingers moved to the edge of her sleeve. Not hurried, not hesitant, controlled, measured. She pulled the fabric back, but not from her arms. Higher, to her shoulder. The motion revealed a patch of bare skin, pale in the low light of the braziers. And there, it was. At first glance it seemed faint, almost subtle, a pattern etched into flesh, barely darker than the skin around it. But as the light shifted, it changed. The lines seemed to ripple, not physically, but perceptually, like heat rising from sun-scorched stone. The edges blurred and sharpened in alternating moments, refusing to settle into a fixed shape. It was not static. It was not inert. It was alive. The pattern itself defied simple description. Curving lines intertwined with sharp angles, forming a design that felt both deliberate and organic, as though it had been grown rather than carved. No ink, no scar, no magic signature that any mortal spellcaster could replicate. This was not a symbol. It was a presence. A dragon's claim. A bond. A legacy. The reaction was immediate. A sharp intake of breath, multiple overlapping. A chair scraped violently against stone as someone stood too quickly. Glass cracked in someone's grip, liquid spilling unnoticed across the table. No, a voice whispered. Another followed, harsher, strained. That cannot be. The armored dragon at the table stepped forward, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the tension beneath. His eyes locked onto the mark, unblinking. That is, he began, and then stopped, because the word did not need to be spoken. Everyone already knew. A dragon's mark. Real, undeniable, and carried by a human's. The scholar's voice trembled, though he clearly fought to control it. No human survives the marking. It was not a challenge, not a question. It was a statement of fact. A law, unbroken, absolute, or at least, it had been. Lysa lowered her sleeve, covering the mark once more. Apparently, she said, her tone unchanged, that's not entirely true. The simplicity of her response struck harder than any denial. Because she did not argue. She did not attempt to justify or explain. She simply stated, and in doing so, she forced them to confront the evidence directly. Silence fell again. But this time it was different. It was not the stunned silence of disbelief. It was heavier, more complex, thoughtful, the kind of silence that formed when something fundamental began to crack. Because dragons did not build their understanding of the world lightly. Their knowledge was layered, tested, refined over centuries. As millennia, laws were not declared, they were proven. Again and again, until they became truths. And one of those truths had just been broken. The eldest dragon exhaled slowly. The sound was deep, resonant, like distant thunder rolling across a horizon. "Your mother lives?" he asked. The question was simple, but beneath it lay countless implications. If she lived, then the law was false. If she lived, then something had changed. "Yes," Lysa said. No hesitation. No doubt. The elder's gaze sharpened. "And she carries this mark still?" "Oh, yes." Again immediate. "Certain." The dragon studied her, as though searching for the smallest inconsistency. "The slightest flaw. And you have seen it." "Oh, yes." A pause followed. Long, measured, heavy. The eldest dragon's mind moved through possibilities, discarding them one by one. Illusions. No. Deception. Unlikely. A new form of magic. Impossible. Or unknowns. The thought settled. Uncomfortables. Unwelcome. But undeniables. He exhaled again, slower this time. "Then either one of our kind has broken laws older than this world," he said quietly. The words hung in the air. Incomplete. But the conclusion was already forming. "Or your species has changed in ways we did not foresee." That possibility was worse. Far worse. Because a rogue dragon was a problem. Contained. Understood. But an entire species evolving beyond expectation. That was something else entirely. That was uncertainty. And dragons did not like uncertainty. Lysa tilted her head slightly. A small gesture. Almost curious. "Maybe," she said, "you just never looked closely." The words were gentle. Almost casual. And yet, they cut deeper than any blade. Because they challenged something fundamental. Not strength. Not power. But perception. Dragons prided themselves on knowing the world. On understanding it. On seeing patterns, predicting outcomes, controlling variables. They watched civilizations rise and fall. They studied magic, biology, history, time itself. They believed, truly believed, that nothing of importance escaped their notice. And yet, here stood a human. Calm, unbroken, carrying proof that something had been missed. Not hidden, not concealed. Missed. The realization spread slowly. Not all at once, but inevitably. Like a crack forming in stone, widening with each passing moment. Around the room, dragons shifted. Some leaned back, withdrawing into thought. Others leaned forward, their interest sharpening into something more focused. A few, very few, looked uneasy. Because if they had overlooked this, what else had they missed? The eldest dragon leaned closer. Not physically, but in presence, in attention. The weight of his focus settled entirely on Lysa. "Child," he said quietly, "do you understand what you are?" The question was not rhetorical. It was not dismissive. It was genuine. Because if she understood, then she was not simply a curiosity. She was something else. Something far more significant. Lysa met his gaze. And for the first time, something changed. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But it was there. A shift in her expression. Not fear. Not defiance. Awareness. Recognition. Of herself. Of them. Of the moment. "Yes," she said. The word was simple. But it carried weight. Because it was not uncertain. Not questioning. Not incomplete. She knew, when that, more than the mark, more than the story, more than the impossibility, that was what made the eldest dragon hesitate. It was a small thing, a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but it happened, and for a being that had lived for millennia, a being that had seen empires rise and fall like tides, a being that had never needed to question its place in the world. That hesitation meant everything, because it signaled doubt, not in hers, in everything he thought he knew. Around them, Imberhal held its breath. Dragons watched, waited, calculated. Something had shifted, not in powers, not in hierarchies, but in understanding. And that was far more dangerous. Because power could be measured, hierarchy could be enforced, but understanding reshaped the world. And at the center of it all stood a human. Still, calm, unafraid, carrying a truth that should not exist. And yet, did. The eldest dragon straightened slowly. His gaze did not leave her, but his thoughts had moved beyond her alone. Beyond the mark, beyond the immediate moments. This was no longer a curiosity. It was a question that demanded an answer. And answers, among dragons, were never simple. Then we have much to discuss, he said at last. The words were quiet, but they carried, across the hall, through every listening mind. And with them, a shift, not just in the room, but in the balance of something far older. Because this was no longer about one human, or one mark, or one broken loss. This was about change, and whether the dragons would control it, or be forced to follow it. And for the first time in a very long while, they did not yet know which it would be. Word spread quickly among dragons. It always had, not through messengers, not through written record, not even through speech. It moved through deeper channels, through ancient bonds, through instinct, through the quiet, unseen threads that connected beings who had lived too long and seen too much to rely on simple communication. A shift in knowledge, a disturbance in certainty, a fracture in law. These things did not remain contained. They rippled outward, and when they did, every dragon felt it. Within hours, Imberhal changed. The transformation was not physical. The obsidian walls remained the same, their polished surfaces still reflecting distorted shapes of firelight and shadow. The braziers continued to burn, their flames steady and low. The long tables stood where they always had, worn smooth by centuries of presence. But the atmosphere shifted. What had been a tavern became something else. Conversations ceased to be casual. Movements became deliberate. Every word carried weight. Every glance carried meaning. Imberhal had become a council chamber. They came, not in crowds, not in spectacle. They arrived as they always did, quietly, deliberately, without announcement. And yet each arrival altered the room. A figure stepping through the doorway, their illusion precise but heavy with power. Another emerging from shadow as though they had always been there. One more appearing at the far end of the hall, their presence bending light just enough to betray the truth beneath. Ancients, beings who had not stirred in centuries. Some had withdrawn from the world entirely, choosing isolation over the slow erosion of time. Others had taken roles unseen, guiding events from distances too great for mortal comprehension. They did not gather lightly. They did not move without reasons. And they did not come out of fear. Dragons did not fear easily. No, what brought them to Imberhal was something far rarer. Uncertainty. At the center of the room stood Lysa. She had not moved far. She had not changed. She still wore the same simple uniform, the same apron tied neatly at her waist. Her sleeves remained rolled, her posture relaxed, her presence unassuming. In her hands, she still held a tray, and she was still completely unafraid. That, more than anything else, held the attention of the room. Because the weight in Imberhall had grown exponentially. Each new arrival added to it, layers of ancient presence pressing against one another, filling the space with a density that would have crushed lesser beings. Even younger dragons felt it. They adjusted their stance, their breathing, their focus, instinctively compensating for the gathering power. And yet, the human at the center remained unchanged. Still, steady, unaffected. It was not defiance. It was not ignorance. It was something far more unsettling. Normalcy. As though this gathering of ancient world-shaping beings, was simply part of her day. You claim lineage. The voice cut through the room. Clear, cold, unyielding. All attention shifted. The speaker stood near the far side of the hall, his form tall and sharp, his illusion less human than most, angles too precise, movements too controlled. His eyes burned a deep, steady crimson. Old. Not the oldest, but old enough. Prove it. The words were simple, but beneath them lay challenge. Not anger, not hostility, expectation. Because claims meant nothing. Proof was everything. Lysa turned her head slightly, acknowledging the speaker. She did not rush to answer. She did not react immediately. Instead, she considered. A small pause, barely noticeable, but in a room filled with beings who measured time in centuries. It mattered, because it showed something important. She was not overwhelmed. She was not pressured. She was thinking, choosing. Then slowly she set the tray down. The motion was deliberate, careful. The soft contact of wood against stone echoed faintly in the quiet hall. Another marker. Another shift. You already know it's true, she said. Her voice was calm. Even, you wouldn't be here otherwise. The words settled into the room. And for a moment, no one spoke. Because it was a dangerous statement. Not because it was bold, but because it was accurate. No dragon present had come out of idle curiosity. They had come because something had already convinced them. Something had reached beyond rumor, beyond speculation, into certainty. And that certainty unsettled them. No one denied her words. Not openly. The silence itself became acknowledgement. At the center table, the eldest dragon stepped forward once more. His presence parted the attention of the room, drawing it toward him like gravity. If what you say is real, he began. His voice carried not through volume but through weight. Then humans are no longer irrelevant to us. The statement was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it was monumental. Because it was an admission. For most of history, humans had existed on the edges of draconic consideration. Observed. Occasionally utilized. Rarely valued. They were too brief. Too fragile. Too temporary. But this changed that. Because relevance was not determined by lifespan. It was determined by impact. And something had shifted. Something that could not be ignored. They never were, Lysa replied. There was no hesitation. No deference. Only quiet certainty. A faint smile touched her lips. Small, almost imperceptible. You just didn't notice. The words hung in the air. Soft, but heavy. And once again, they struck deeper than any direct challenge. Because they did not confront strength. They confronted perception. And dragons, for all their powers, were not accustomed to being told they had overlooked something. Another silence followed. But this one was different. It was not shock. Not disbelief. Not even tension. It was thinking. Deep. Layered. Complex. Across the room, dragons shifted in subtle ways. Some leaned back, withdrawing into contemplation. Others remained still, their focus sharpening inward. A few glanced toward one another, silent exchanges passing between ancient minds. recalculation, reevaluation, adjustment. Dragons, for all their power, had one defining trait. They adapted, not quickly, not impulsively, but thoroughly. When they changed, they did so completely. And when they did, the world followed. The eldest dragon studied Lysa in silence, not as a curiosity, not as an anomaly, but as something else. A variable, a factor, a point of change. And your mother, he said at last. The question carried weight, more than the others, because this was the source, the origin of the fracture in law. Where is she? The room stilled. Attention sharpened. Because this answer mattered, more than any others. Lysa bent slightly, retrieving her tray. The motion was casual, familiar, grounding. She straightened, balancing it easily in one hand. Working, she said. The word landed oddly in the heavy air. Simple, ordinary, almost absurd in its normalcy. Like me. For a moment, the room did not react. Then, a subtle shift, a flicker of confusion, a disruption in expectation. Because that answer did not fit. Not with what they knew. Not with what they expected. Working, one of the dragons repeated. The word sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, as though it did not belong in this context. Lysa nodded toward the bar. The gesture was small, casual, but it drew every gaze. And there, behind the counters, another human moved. Older, her movements slower but no less steady. She polished a glass, her attention on her work, as though the room were not filled with beings who could unmake cities. As though nothing unusual was happening. She says power doesn't mean much if you don't know how to live, Lysa said. The words were simple, unadorned, but they carried something else. Perspective. And for beings who had lived for millennia, perspective was not easily challenged. The eldest dragon watched the woman at the bar. His gaze lingered, not searching, not probing, observing, and in that observation, something shifted, because he saw it. Not the mark, not directly, but something around it. A presence, subtle, contained, but real. A trace of something that did not belong to humanity alone. And yet, it existed. Comfortably, naturally, without strain, without conflict, as though it had always been there. He looked back at Lysa, really looked, not at the surface, but deeper, and for the first time, he did not see contradiction. He saw continuity, a line, a connection, something new, something possible. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of thought, of realization, of something approaching understanding. Then, slowly, the eldest dragon laughed. The sound was unexpected. Low, deep, not sharp, not mockings. There was no cruelty in it. No dismissal. Instead, there was something else. Something rare. Recognition. Perhaps, he said, the faintest trace of a smile touching his expression. It is time we learned. The words settled. Not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. Around the room, ancient beings, lords of fire and sky, of mountain and storm, fell into thoughtful silence. Not the silence of dominance, not the silence of superiority, but something quieter, more reflective, because for the first time in a very long while, they were not the ones with all the answers. And that, more than anything, was change. At the center of it all, Lysa adjusted her grip on the tray. A small movement. Practical, grounded. She glanced around the room once more. At the gathered dragons. At the weight of centuries pressing into a single moment. At the shift that had begun. Then, she turned and walked back toward the tables. Her steps were the same as before. Measured, steady, unhurried. She picked up an empty glass, wiped the surface of a table, adjusted a chair slightly out of place. Simple tasks, routine, ordinary, because to her, this was just another shift, another night, another set of customers. But behind her, the world had changed. Dragons watched her, not as one watches something insignificant, not as one observes a passing curiosity, but as one studies a turning point, because they understood something now, something they had not before. Power was not always loud, not always obvious, not always ancient. Sometimes, it was quiet, subtle, growing in places they had not thought to look. And when it emerged, it did not ask permission. It simply was. The eldest dragon remained where he stood, his gaze following Lysa's movements for a moment longer. Then he turned slightly, addressing the others. No commands, no declarations, no immediate decisions. Because this required something else. Time, thought, understanding, and dragons, for all their powers, knew the value of patience. But as they began to consider, to adapt, to change, one truth settled firmly into place. Unavoidable, unshakable, humanity was no longer beneath their notice. And perhaps it never had been. The firelight flickered. The murmurs began again, quieter now, more focused. Discussions formed, not of dominance, but of possibility. And at the heart of it all, a single sentence remained, echoing, enduring. My mother bears your mark. A simple statement, a quiet truth, and the beginnings of everything that followed.